What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Club and Sub podcast. We're repping at episode number 89 right now, approaching that 100. Appreciate all your guys' support today so far. Show some support for your boys. Hit that like, hit that subscribe. It helps the channel out immensely. I'll be taking over the hosting duties this week as our resident host. Mr. John Stargarian is entertaining the wife tonight for his birthday. So it'll be me and my boy Danny Legs breaking this card down for you boys, gents, and D-gents. We got a 12-fight slate tonight. Lags, high-level thoughts. What do you think about the card for this week?
A lot of people think it's a little low level. I mean, yeah, it kind of is, I guess, from like a general perspective. But there's a lot of good name value here. I think there's going to be a lot of good fights, and there's a lot of good betting perspective that we'll go through.
Absolutely. All right, let's jump into it. First fight of the night, we got Taira taking on Mr. Carlos Candelario. What do you got here, Legs?
Yeah, it's my first fight of the card, first bet of the card. So I got a unit and a half on Carlos Candelario here, plus 200. And pretty much I just think that I have a good soldier here that I'm sending into against Tatsuro, who to me just kind of seems like a back take specialist. On the feet, he just kind of has a low output, just plays that outside kicking game, doesn't have a ton of volume. And I don't think his wrestling is anything super special, to be honest with you. So for him to be minus 250-ish, I kind of think that you would have to think that he just takes him down and submits him kind of instantly. And I just think Candelario puts up a solid fight. He has solid cardio other than, obviously we saw that last fight with Altamirano, but, he was on 10 days notice in that fight. So I think a lot of people are giving him a lot of heat for that fight. So, yeah, I think it's a good fight for him. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm kind of right there with you, bro. I haven't officially pulled the trigger on it just because I'm kind of curious to see where the line moves. It seems like, it has been more one-way traffic on Candelario so far, but I do think Tyro's going to get some bounce back. So I could butcher
Okay.
it potentially, but I do
Yeah.
think Candelario's the side, and I think I might be able to snag him better at a better number later in the week as Tatsuro probably takes some more parlay money because it's also an interesting card because we have so many closer-ish, lined fights. I think you're going to see a lot of more casual parlay money just, auto go to the Tyros, the Levies, the
The
Romanovs, the
Feelies.
Feelies, right? So, I mean, you
Yeah.
only have so many parlay options. So I think you're going to see some of that a bit later in the week. And I do think we'll see Candelario probably back up around, minus 220 or minus 230 or so. Could be wrong. Once again, could butcher it and get too greedy there. But I do think you're on the right track there with Candelario. My thing with him is I had like plus 200 on him over Altamirano on his Contender Series fight. In my opinion, he won that fight. You touched on it. The dude comes
Yeah.
in
First two
on.
rounds, in my opinion.
Yeah, I thought he won the first two rounds pretty clean, to be honest. Obviously, dropped the third as he slowed. You touch on, homeboy comes in on 10 days' notice, not an optimal scenario. And the one thing I will say about Altamirano, Altamirano, former LFA champs, not no can in any stretch of the imagination there. And you touched on it with Tyro to boot, the guy, I think, for me, passes the eye test. Like, he looks pretty good. He seems to have decent mechanics at space, but we haven't still seen a ton of him at space. We haven't seen him face really any striking based adversity at all. He's just been able to, either take guys down, backpack them, transition to triangles from top position, and, do his song and dance, but he hasn't faced, once again, that striking based resistance. He hasn't faced that wrestling based resistance. He hasn't faced that grappling based resistance. And a guy in Candelario is a brown belt in jiu-jitsu. I do have some concerns given the historic tape. The guy has gotten his back taken on multiple occasions. I get it, but he's never been submitted as a pro. So it's like, okay, what happens if the guy goes ahead, does one of the pull the arms over, spins in the guard, and now we see Mr. Tyro on his back, largely for the first time extended in his whole career. I don't know. I think it could get very interesting in that scenario. And like I said, I haven't even really seen the guy punch in the face, right? So how
I'll
does
be
he
honest.
react?
I think the guy's fairly hittable on the feet. To be honest with you, I don't think he defends strikes great.
Yeah, and in general, I agree with you. And I mean, I think we're just going to see it's a questions answered spot
Right.
for me. He could come out here and 100% look his price, and I wouldn't be overtly shocked, but it's another one of those scenarios where he could very well not look his price, and you have a plus 200 Candelario ticket, and it looks great. 23-year-old Japanese-based grappler. what could go wrong? That was kind of the kind of theme that we
Yeah.
were talking about in our group chat this week. What could go wrong? In an example I gave, even on my Patreon, I can't really unsee the Max Roshkoff Austin Hubbard fight. A guy who's coming in on the regionals, pretty strong wrestling background, pretty strong grappling background, running through everybody. Those takedowns, started to face some more resistance. The guy started to get punched in the face a little bit. Homeboy took his ball and went home on the stool at the end of the second
Yeah.
round. I ain't saying that's what's going to happen here. My point being is you got a pretty chalky favorite on a guy you still really don't know anything about, who's only 23 years old, making his debut against a guy who I think Candelario, who's pretty tough and reasonably well rounded. So I think Candelario is the side as well, and I think you might be onto something there as well. Legs. All right. Next fight, we got Mrs. Gina Mazzani taking on Shanna Young. What do you got here, Legs?
So I'm not really, trying to, take the road from the crowd on the public this week on with Gina Mazzani. I guess my issue with her is really just her cardio wasn't great. I mean, obviously her last fight with Cachoeira, it's a big red flag. Everybody's kind of like drilled down on her and whatnot. But like to me, I just always thought her cardio wasn't that great, and she's going to try to implement a wrestling heavy game plan. Like I think it should be easy. I think she should be able to roll here over Young, who doesn't have great takedown defense in general. It should be a walk in the park. I think Young is going to get her pink slip after this fight, but it's just another one like Gina Mazzani minus 180. I'm just not trying to lay it. It's just another pass spot.
Gotcha. So yeah, I'm actually was kind of an earlier mover on it. I got Mazzani, I think minus 150. I think
There
it's
you
a
go.
decent spot for her to be honest. Would I lay 180? Probably not, to be honest, but I think 150, I think it's a fair price. Um, Obviously two girls, not UFC caliber, laying chalk on that, it's always it's always rough in that scenario, and I get it, and I've been burned on it a few times. But stylistically, like I really can't, ignore what's being brought to the table from Mazzani here. In my opinion, I think she's the better wrestler. She's a girl who's consistent to throw strikes on the feet, and if you really look, how she's getting beat by, it's better, stronger, physical, more wrestlers than her. Girls who are better in the clinch, like Lena Landsberg. Girls who are more aggressive, more powerful, like your Julia Avilas and even the Priscilla Cachoeiras. I know the Cachoeira loss looks horrible on paper if you just look at it, but I mean, Cachoeira hits really hard for 125, and is a girl who's incredibly tough at the same time. And even then, Gina Mazzani was winning, 80% of that fight prior to that. And my problem with Young is you go back and look at all of her 4 pro losses, she's historically really struggled on the ground despite coming from that wrestling background. I don't think her takedown defense is very good. And when she's been flattened with her, shoulders on the mat, it just hasn't looked pretty, and she's largely looked pretty lost on bottom and even on the feet, despite all the issues I have with Mazzani. She's not the most technical party in the world. She's not very good defensively, but Young is kind of like, in a handful of fights I've seen her fight, like even more like point fighting karate base. She's going to sit on the outside, like try to throw these little side kicks. She's not overtly aggressive. She's not overtly high output. She hasn't shown any real power components that lead me to believe that she can, catch Mazzani in something at least at a high clip, or even then go out there and significantly outpace Gina Mazzani. So it's, once again, it's kind of weird. It's just one of these lower level fights, but I kind of think Mazzani almost has her covered in every
Yeah,
single
no,
capacity, which is why I thought, in my opinion, she's worth a play at minus 155, or I'm sorry, minus 150. Would I, load up on it? Obviously not. Lower level nature brings more
yeah.
variance. 100%. I get it. Once again, been burned on some of these spots in the past, but it's like, I cannot concede what I've seen. I cannot concede the stylistics. Like Gina Mazzani, this should be a great get right spot for her. She should be able to get back in the win column. She should beat this girl, at a moderate clip. I also think her going back down to 125 pounds will be a good thing for her. I think that's a big thing too. She's lost a lot of these fights up at 135 pounds against, bigger, more physical, and just generally better UFC caliber level girls. Where Shanna Young is just not, who also had a baby, I think 14 months ago. So throw that into the baby
Yeah.
narrative
Yep.
standpoint too. So I like Mazzani to put her down and actually finish her out with ground and pound. So, all right, on to
I
our
don't,
third fight.
I don't hate it. Yeah, because actually, sorry, real quick, I guess to touch on, I was on Egger and Young's last fight too, because again, kind of same thing. great stylistic. And kind of, I think we got similar line on her, if I'm not mistaken. I think she was around that minus 150 line, but
I
I
think
can't
she was like,
recall.
I think pretty much everyone on the club and sub played her. I think
Yeah.
we played like minus 130s or minus
Yeah.
140s on
Before
Egger
it
in
got,
that
yeah, I think
fight.
it got steamed later in that week. Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I think we got early lines in her. All right. Anyway, next fight, Mike Breeden versus Natan Levy. I'll kick this one off. Kind of a, I guess, kind of quote unquote narrative of the card, not the highest level fight in the world. I'm not the biggest fan of Natan Levy. I actually cashed Hoffa Garcia at plus money against him in his last fight. He's a actually guy who comes from a karate based background, black belt in that discipline. He kicks more than he punches, but I would actually say he's a better wrestler, grappler than he is
Yeah.
a striker, which makes it interesting because I just always have a problem with, karate based archetypes in 2022, unless you can play that game, largely elite, like a Wonder Boy Thompson or someone who can really like point fight based well, because if you can't, once again, you're lower volume. Historically, you don't have much power. Levy doesn't. I don't think he has any pro wins via knockout at the same time. So on the feet, it's largely pretty competitive. If not, he's probably getting beat the majority of the time. And the thing with this Mike Breeden guy, he kind of more so falls into the meat and potatoes type of category for me. He doesn't do anything overtly well on the feet, but he is aggressive. He will throw his hands. He does have power. I think he's finished 8 of his 10 pro wins via knockout to boot. So I think if, despite maybe his lack of technical acumen necessarily, he's aggressive. And if he can go out there and get after a guy like Natan Levy, I think he can definitely close the margins on the feet here. So I don't think he's screwed in that capacity. I am picking Levy to win, though, because I do think he is the better wrestler grappler in the matchup who probably has physical advantages to boot. But we still haven't seen Mike Breeden like held down extensively at the same time either, which I think is also interesting. This matchup, who is a brown belt in jiu-jitsu to boot, I don't believe he's ever been submitted as well. So it's another weird fight. It's kind of one of those spots. I don't really
Yeah.
know who's laying minus 200 on Natan Levy, like, or using him as a parlay. Like, I don't know. Once again, lower level fight, but I do think he has wrestling advantages in this fight, which is what should get the job done for him. But from some capacity, I do think Breeden could be a live dog. And I don't think you can take too much away from, his last fight. Dude comes in on short notice against Alexander Hernandez, who's, despite, being on a bit of a skid recently for Hernandez, still a fringe top 15 fighter at the weight class. So he goes out there and gets blasted in 2 minutes. It's kind of like, all right, whatever. Is that the game in
Yeah.
Natan Levy? Not at all. He hasn't shown that even over regional caliber competition. So I don't think there's too much you can take away from that for Mr. Breeden. So pick his Levy by decision. What do you think, Legs?
Yeah, kind of similar to you. I kind of think that Levy's grappling is going to be what gets it done here in the spot. I think on the feet it's pretty close, but I just think Breeden's your categorical brawler, just going to come forward, trying to land big strikes. And I just kind of think that obviously Levy, as you touched on, Levy's the best grappler wrestler he's fought before. I think Levy should be able to just wrestle him, get him down whenever, take him out to a decision. But yeah, again, like you touched on, minus 200, Natan Levy, I don't really know who's trying to lay that. So it's just kind of one of those fights you want to pass on, really.
All right. Next fight of the night, we got my boy Gabe Green taking on Johan Lines. What do you got for me, Legs?
So again, kind of similar to the Gina Mazzani fight. I'm not really trying to go off the road from everybody with Gabe Green here. I don't really mind it in the spot, but to me, he's just super hittable, to be honest with you. I mean, he has the volume edge, he has the cardio edge in this fight. I don't think Lioness is anything special outside of that round one power, but Green is super hittable as well. Like it wouldn't shock me if Lioness was able to clip him, hurt him in that first round, and put him out. So to me, I was actually looking at the fight doesn't go, but initially it opened at minus 160. I think it's been taking some heat. It's like minus 210 now, and I was even looking for an alternate under 2.5, but that's it also at minus 190. So not really looking at anything. I think Green probably puts it on him late, but it wouldn't shock me if Lioness catches him early.
Yeah, it looks like we're seeing the fight doesn't go all the way up over minus 200 now. I think DraftKings
Oh
actually
yeah.
opened at minus 250, so
Oh wow.
that's definitely got hit a
Yeah.
bit in a few books. I guess I'm more so on the green side, but as under the pretense of an earlier mover, I played him at minus 115.
Yeah.
We've
I don't
seen him
think that
definitely
line. Yeah.
take some steam. He actually is, I should say, Linus is getting some buyback right now, and we are seeing the lowest line on green at -127. But my take is actually for a lot of the points you make, but actually why I'm deciding to play him at the same time, because I do think the pacing in the fight is just different. I've never been a big fan of Linus. I actually laid a pretty sizable bet on Justin Burlinson against him on the Contender Series. And in my opinion, Burlinson's actually probably one of the better fighters who fought on the entire Contender Series. It just so happened he did not perform very well. He got clipped within a couple minutes, so it is what it is. But if you run that fight back, 10 or so times, I honestly think Burlinson probably beats him 8 out of 10 times, if I'm being completely honest. Yeah, I mean, you touched on. I mean, the guy. I think the guy's powerful. He's just largely been a front-loaded KO based artist, but we've just seen this, time and time again in the UFC. These guys who come in who are front-loading KOs regionally, when it doesn't happen, what happens for them. Historically, it just doesn't go well, and we tend to see more decisions. Not to say that this fight is going to go the distance. That's not what I'm saying, but just when they're fighting a more battle-tested guy, who can take some shots. I know that Green's been knocked out in 2 of his 3 pro losses. I get it, but we're even going back, to Jalen Turner back in, I think, like 2017 before that. But I mean, in regards to Gabe Green, the guy came in and fought D-Rod, who's, a fringe top 15 guy on pretty short notice, 8 over 100 significant strikes. I'm sorry, like 170 significant strikes in that fight, landed over 100 of his own. I thought he made a decent account of himself in that showing, all things considered. Historically, you put those two together, I mean, that's like auto, smash finish spot for Daniel Rodriguez. But, there was some resistance put up there from Gabe Green. The guy goes out there and, debilitates the legs of Phil Rowe, who's also a pretty crafty submission grappler, pretty long guy who we know at this point hits pretty hard as well, and went out there and won that fight. So my thing is that I just don't think Linus has proven much to me. I think his cardio is a liability. If you go back and even watch some of his regional fights that have been more extended, the guy is huffing and puffing a little bit when it comes to the second round, where I think Green's cardio is more proven. I think his output is more proven. He could definitely get dinged here. I don't like his ability necessarily to get his back taken at the same time, but he's pretty scrambly, has shown to be competent to get out of any sort of dominant position he's been in. He's shown some offensive wrestling upside to boot. So once again, confidence interval is not large here. Take is in relation to where I played it. I played Green at Pick'em. I don't think it should be a Pick'em fight. I think it should be, Green 60, 65% personally. So that is where I'm rocking with my boy Gabe Green on the money line.
Last thing real quick. I was actually just looking and actually might be a play for me. The fight ends by KO is -105. I don't think that's a horrible line personally.
That's not bad. I mean, they're going to throw.
Yeah.
Both guys defend strikes like shit. So I mean, I can't really hate on anybody taking that. I just think from like a minute winning perspective, I think Gabe Green's the much bigger minute winner. So
and has a grappling upside as well.
At Pick'em, you know me. I love me my minute winners.
Yes.
I love me my minute winners. So I'm going to take that at Pick'em any day of the week, who also has finishing upside. So, all right, we got next fight. We got Daniel Da Silva, sometimes named Lacerda. I don't know what the fuck this guy's name is, but we're going to go for Da Silva just based on his tapology. So we got Daniel Da Silva versus Little Fig, Mr. Francisco Figueroa.
Mr. Walmart Fig.
Walmart Fig. We've heard a lot of funny names.
Yes,
for this.
There's been a lot of good ones. Yeah,
we should probably start one of them little coffee books or whatever, that people make. They're sitting on the turlet, trying to read and do some shit. I think we could come up with some fun names for little shitty Fig here. But we got Silva, Figueroa. What do you got for me, Lex?
So there's not a ton of tape on the Lacerda side, and I guess Da Silva. We'll go with Da Silva. He just seems like, again, kind of a front runner. He has big power. He has decent grappling upside. Like, I think you could use that here as well, but there's not a ton of footage of him outside of that first round really getting finishes. And yeah, he could get Fig out of there. It wouldn't really shock me, but I don't really think Fig is UFC caliber. I think Da Silva should be able to get a win in the spot, should be able to finish him. And I think Da Silva inside the distance at like +200 is interesting, considering all of his wins are inside the distance and mostly in the first round.
Yeah, dude, it's another one of those weird fights that's kind of the theme of the card. You know, a lot of non-UFC caliber fighters. I think we have less than 15 minutes on De Silva overall. So it's like, all right, when it comes to, handicapping these guys, especially then you throw in the Brazilian regional scene narrative, which isn't always, the most predictive thing in the world. It always makes a fight difficult to handicap, where we actually do have more data out there on Mr. Figueroa for sure, but the data out there on Mr. Figueroa has not, been pretty. I really cannot get the Malcolm Gordon fight out of my head, where despite, him having some offensive wrestling based success on Gordon, I mean, he was out wrestled by Malcolm Gordon at the same time too. He looked pretty bad in the latter stages of that fight. We know Malcolm Gordon is not a UFC caliber fighter who's more of a bottom player jiu-jitsu guy. He was actually outstruck by Malcolm Gordon too. I mean, he actually made Malcolm Gordon look like fucking Floyd Mayweather in that fight, if I'm being completely honest too. So it's like, that's very, very concerning. At the same time, once again, we just don't have a ton on Mr. Silva to say necessarily, okay, what does he look like in extended exchanges? Because that's the problem I've had with Fig, is that his pacing, similar to his brother in a lot of ways, is very inconsistent. He seems to be a pretty low volume esque type guy, but I can't make any definitive claims to say Silva's going to go out there and pace him over 50 minutes. I just don't know, because I haven't seen the guy. I believe I don't think he's been out of the first round, or I haven't seen, at least audio or visually, see him fight out of the first round. I've seen him look decent from top position, but he also looked pretty bad on bottom against Jeff Molina at the same time. Once again, Fig's shown some decent things on, from top, at least in the early portions of that Gordon fight, and against Homeboy in his fight prior to that. So to me, this is just an incredibly high variance spot where I don't know how anybody can really be laying a money line here and have any sort of confidence. I think you have a lack of data on Silva. I think you have a very inconsistent fighter in Figueroa. You have a 125-pound fight where two guys finish a lot too, but it's also a weight class that doesn't finish a lot historically. So that brings a whole nother wrench, into the soup. Yeah, I guess I'd probably be more inclined to take a violence route. I mean, my official prediction is Silva by decision, but I mean, who really knows?
Yeah.
In this fight, it's tough. It's a really tough one to call. So, bring on the variance for this one.
Yep.
All right, I'm waiting for the hot take on this one, Lags. We got Mr. Alexander Romanov versus Chase Sherman being booked back for the second time. We had this fight booked last week, but unfortunately, Mr. Sherman stubbed his toe, his pinky, or something like that, and apparently did not want to fight last week. So we are now getting this booked back for the second time. Any hot takes on Mr. Sherman?
Needs to be brought up again. The best nickname fight we got going on: King Kong versus the Vanilla Gorilla. But no, I mean, similar to how I broke it down last week. I think it's a nightmare matchup for Mr. Sherman. I think he's just getting a good contract. He's probably going to get fed killers in all 3 or 4 of these fights, and probably see his way out of the UFC fairly soon. I don't really think there's any value in any kind of Romanov prop. You're looking at the under 1.5 is at -300. I mean, Romanov inside the distance is -500. I think you're pretty much kind of guessing whether or not he pounds him out or submits him. So it's a pass. Romanov should smash, but there's no way you should be playing this fight.
Yeah, I'm kind of right there with you as well. Off the top, the boys on this podcast are not going to tell you guys to go out there and parlay a -2,500. I mean, you ain't getting that from this podcast. And if I did say that, I think John may exile me if I ever even did say that anyway. You would not be very happy. But you ain't getting no parlay value out of Mr. Romanov at -25. What are you getting? 2 cents, 3 cents off your parlay? I mean, come on, guys, you ain't getting nothing there. And then Legs touched on, the under 1.5, we're set, -300. And now you're kind of playing the guessing game with the finish route. Does he pound him out? Does he submit him? I would be more so inclined to the pound him out route, but honestly, I'm pretty concerned about what happened in the last fight. Him just, getting taken down by Collier, who made Collier look like Jordan Burroughs, take his back and sub him in, I think, less than 3 minutes. Collier obviously ain't out there the best wrestler grappler in the world either. So that's pretty concerning to boot. So it's kind of one of those, Amanda Nunes type of spots, how is the person going to slaughter the lamb, and that's what you're trying to figure out in your head in terms of how you're going to bet it. It's those fights for me personally. Give me everything away from, like, get me away from it. Like, I don't want anything to do with it. Stay off of it. Romanov's going to run him, but do you really want your money anywhere near? How much value are you extracting out of it? Probably almost nothing, right? So Romanov domination kills him. Chase Sherman going to go on to get booked to do the job to the next 3 guys. He's going to fight, be out of the UFC, and make more money than probably 50% of the roster. So props to Chase Sherman for doubling his pay, coming in to go out here and do the jobs to these boys. So I ain't going to shit on Mr. Chase Sherman. He knows his role 100%. So all
He's
right,
getting paid for it.
yeah, he is. He is. Like I said, I was talking with my boys on Pub Sports earlier today. You know, it's almost like it's one of the weird UFC modern angles. We got like a pro wrestling type thing here. How often do you see a guy that's really being brought in to fucking lose and do the job to somebody? That is Jay Sherman. You know, in 2022,
Yeah.
how many guys have had over 10 UFC fights that have a record of 3-8 and are still within the promotion?
Yeah, it'd be tough. It'd be tough to try. I'm trying to think. Sam Alvey, is he up there?
Sam Alvey's like 50-50.
Well, like recent. Why? Well, I guess I should say in the recent run. I guess total UFC, he's probably close to 50-50. I guess on the recent run, it's not so hot. But yeah, that's unfair to judge. That's unfair to judge him. But yeah,
crazy.
Yes, crazy.
Nonetheless, we move on to our main card opener. We got Gerald Meerschaert, my boy out of Wisco, taking on Mr. Christoph Jotko. I'll start this one out. Weird fight, really weird fight, weird dynamic. You got a guy in Jotko who's, been around for a second now and has proven to be a winner at the end of the day. You know, he is a lower to average volume point fighter, but he plays that game particularly well. Now taking on a guy in GM3 who we know is arguably one of the most crafty submission artists in the UFC to date. I think right now he's actually number 1 active in terms of submissions in the middleweight division and actually number 3rd overall in UFC history in terms of submissions. So GM3 is not a guy you can go out there and sleep on at all. But stylistically, I don't want to say it's a good fight for Jotko because that's not the best way to classify it. I just think his takedown defense sitting at 83%, he's largely been able to stay upright throughout the course of his career, even in his last fight against Serkinov, who was able to take him down 5 times, actually get to back ride on him at multiple points. You know, he did a pretty good job of, nullifying hooks or any sort of dominant positions. And we know that Meerschaert Serkinov, say what you want about him at this point, guy's pretty strong, was coming down from heavyweight. He's a pretty strong submission grappler at the same time. Jotko did well fine with that. And, there's been a couple other fights, I think, even against David Branch, who's also a pretty strong grappler. He got put on his back. I thought he dealt fine in those positions there. So I'm not counting GM3 out here in any stretch of the imagination, because honestly, I think he has that crafty, weird nature to force scrambles and force positions. You can't make small mistakes against him. I think he can sub anybody, but I think in the aggregate, from a betting perspective, it's hard to like overtly project that at like anything higher than 15 to 20%. That's just my opinion. At the same time, the problem I have with Jotko, despite me thinking he's the better striker, the better, point fighter in the matchup, he doesn't throw a ton, right? The margins in Jotko fights tend to be close, right? Despite winning, unanimous decisions, they're not large margins. So my thing is, like, I do think GM3 has improved his striking over the years. It's still not pretty. He's still hittable 100%. But I think if he can come forward, just chuck his hands, make this gritty, mix it up in the clinch a little bit, I think he can close the gap, in the striking in this fight. Now, if he decides to stand there and have a 15-minute kickboxing match with Jotko, I think he loses that at a moderate clip. But I also did have that somewhat same opinion when he fought homeboy Muradov. And, he landed some good shots on Muradov in that fight too, and definitely hurt him to boot. So, like, I'm not counting Gerald out in this fight at all, but I more so see range, slowness there, some potential clinchness, Jotko's defensively responsible enough if he does get taken down. If he's on top, I think he can be defensively responsible there. So my play for the fight is actually the over 2.5 at -115. I think Jotko's fights have only finished twice in his last 15. Obviously, Meerschaert, it's kind of like kill or be killed, but Jotko can't bust a grape standing. He's not going to submit GM3, in my opinion. So I think the large finish equity is probably with GM3. But once again, I think he's probably going to struggle to get takedowns. How did those transitions happen? I'm not sure. So do I have any supreme degree of confidence in it? No, but I do think it's a fight in a style dynamic that should go over more than, 52 or so % of the time. So that is my play on the fight. What do you think, Legs?
Yeah, so to touch on what you were talking about before, Jotko just being so, like, his margins not being very high and he's just kind of a low volume guy. That's why I slammed Sean Strickland when they fought, because I knew that Sean was just going to beat the piss out of him, honestly, standing. I thought it wasn't even going to be close. And then I played Serkinov small in his last fight, and honestly, my problem with Serkinov is that he just doesn't have great cardio. I mean, he has, again, kind of similar to GM3. It's a similar stylistic game plan here. I just trust GM3 a little bit more in that regard. Obviously, he has a 94% finish rate. I'm playing GM3 no scorecards at +120 for a unit and a half. I think that line is crazy and should be around like that -150 line because, like you touched on, Jotko can't bust a grape. He doesn't really have any finishing ability at all, and GM3 is all finishing ability. Like I touched on, 94% finisher. I think he could obviously like you touched on. I think it's going to be interesting. It's an interesting fight just because Jotko has good takedown defense, but it's also like GM3 is not just going to sit there. He's a guy that constantly brings pressure, constantly tries to like make a dog fight. So to me, I think GM3 no scorecards is a solid play on this fight.
Yeah, I think that's a good look. I mean, at plus money to play GM3 to finish, like.
And then to touch on your over, I don't really hate that either because again, like I think more often than not it does. But again, it's also interesting because like my bet could push and have no issue, and it goes over 2.5. So.
Yeah,
I think it's just a smart way to play GM3 in my opinion.
I can't disagree. I think that's a decent look too. All right, we got Mr. Darren the Damage Elkins taking on Tristan Connolly. What do you got, Legs?
Yeah, another chalky favorite we got here this weekend. I'm just not really trusting the Damage. To me, it just kind of seems like he's done. He's shot. It just. I mean, it seems like a decent fight for him and for Connolly. Connolly's second fight coming down to 145. I don't think the weight class is right for him to begin with. So, in theory, again, I think it's a solid matchup for Elkins, but I think he's just shot to bits at this point.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I'm having some issue on it as well, because I think stylistically, statistically, historically, on paper, this should be a great fight for Darren Elkins. I don't think there's many people who would disagree with me there. I mean, he's the much better wrestler in the fight. I mean, we just saw Tristan Connolly go out there and get controlled, for 2/3 of the fight against Pat Sabatini, who is also a pretty strong wrestler archetype to boot. So I don't really think Elkins should have much issue landing takedowns. Once again, the problem I have with him is he's 37 years old. He's slurring his words, in interviews. He's getting dropped twice by Ryan Hall not that long ago, who's a jiu-jitsu guy similar to Connolly. At the same point, Cub Swanson, I'll give him a slighter bit of a pass there, even though Cub Swanson historically hasn't been the most gigantic hitter in recent years, but nonetheless, Cub Swanson's still, a decent fighter. My big issue, and this is where I'm kind of like warped from my betting mindset, right? Because I think it's a great spot for Elkins. And I think in a large majority of scenarios, I should be playing Darren Elkins. But at the same time, when these guys get to this drop-off point, sometime there's just like a point of no return for them where we have seen, these guys get in their late 30s, early 40s, where they start losing fights to guys they just quite frankly shouldn't. I mean,
Vince Pichel, homeboy Vince Pichel, not too long ago. Not to shit on him, but I think he handily should have been able to beat Mark Madsen, but he just looked kind of slow out there, to be honest with you.
Yeah, my thing with Connolly is he's just not like any big of a. He's not a hitter though. Like he's a jiu-jitsu guy. Yeah. Like he should not give Elkins much issues on the feet from like a knockout standpoint, like I said, but I'm legitimately so concerned at this point for Elkins where he could be so washed that he gets dropped by a jab. Like that's how concerned I am for him at this point. But nonetheless, I still think it's in Elkins' favored or pass spot. You know, I just unless Conley knocks him out, I just don't think he submits a guy like Darren Elkins. I mean, the last time Elkins has been submitted, I think has been over 12 years, coming to Charles Oliveira, who we know is the best submission artist in the UFC. I mean, Elkins has fought, you know, elite level competition. Yeah, it's tough. I honestly I cannot hate anybody betting Elkins because that's what my analytical mind tells me to do. I should be betting Elkins, but there's something that's telling me that it could be a trap and then he's just completely cooked. So I'm staying off of it completely. We'll see if I regret it.
It's always tough to try to like time like those peaks, like where guys is just like that one fight where guys just fall off. I just, as you were talking about it, like the fight that came to my mind was Jacare Souza and Andre Muniz. It's just kind of like those kind of spots where it's just like, damn it, you know.
Wonder Boy Bilal.
Yep.
I mean, five
Another
years ago,
spot.
would
Yep.
Bilal out wrestle Wonder Boy? No.
No.
He wouldn't, in my opinion. So yeah, I mean
that's crazy.
That's
MMA is a crazy
point.
sport, man. Yeah,
it's a great point. So I'm staying off of it. I know our boy John is, I think, pretty heavy on Elkins, and I think he might be sitting pretty off of this one. But I'm gonna try to mind my P's and Q's on this one, and I'm probably gonna stay off. But I do think it is a favorite or pass spot on Elkins nonetheless. All right, we got Jared Gordon versus Grant Dawson. I'll kick this one off. Another pretty interesting fight. I've actually been a bit lower on Dawson than most people, which sounds probably terrible considering the guy is 17-1-1 as a pro. It's mainly from the striking perspective. I still think he's a pretty developing striker. I don't think he's anything special. I don't think he's anything overtly technical there. He's still incredibly hittable, especially going back to, the Trezano and Erosa fights and, those type of dynamics where I do actually think Gordon is the better technical boxer here. The problem I have for Gordon is that I think Dawson's just the much better wrestler in the matchup, who's much physically stronger than Gordon. And Gordon has a really poor tendency to give his back and get controlled at points in certain fights too. And I just think it's a really bad tendency to have in a matchup against a guy like Grant Dawson personally. And Jared Gordon historically, is not the biggest hitter in the world either. So despite some of the defensive issues I have with Dawson, I don't think Jared's the guy who's going to go out there and knock him out. I don't think he's the guy that's going to go out there and submit Dawson. So it's one of those spots where I think in terms of who's winning minutes in this fight, I think it's going to be Grant Dawson. I also think from like a side narrative perspective, it's encouraging that Dawson's going down to ATT now. I think it's going to be a good move for him, moving from Glory with Krause. I know that's been kind of the big, area in where he's been at historically, probably better from a game plan perspective at that point in his career. But I mean, you're just not getting a lot of bodies to work with out there. Now he's going to a real camp, a real gym. He's going to have guys like Gamrot, down there. He's just going to have so many more looks to deal with. And I think it's going to make him evolve much more as a fighter down at ATT. So I do think Dawson is the side here. I was kind of contemplating laying it at one point when he got down closer to minus 150, but it has gotten bet up a little bit. I'm now somewhere pivoting to the decision route for Dawson that currently sits about plus 150. Obviously, the guy's been like a crazy finisher historically, but once again, Jared Gordon survived, dominant base positions with really good grapplers at the same point. I don't think Dawson's much of a hitter, which has obviously been the main issue for Gordon and getting knocked out, I think, in 3 of his 4 pro losses to boot. So, I more so see dominant grinding wrestling from Dawson. He could pound him out, but at plus money at plus 150, the most likely outcome by decision, that's kind of where I'm looking for myself. What do you think, Legs?
Yeah, I kind of see a dominant grappling based win for Dawson as well. But to me, not only like his striking is he hittable, it's also just seemed like I was watching the Leo Santos fight again. He just seems very basic in his striking. He just similar like same kind of movements back and forth, and it's just not. I don't know. To me, it just seems very basic. He's not improving his striking. Obviously, like you touched on, he's moved to ATT now. It's going to be a great move for him for this fight. But to me, it's just more of like a watch and learn type of spot on this because I think this is Jared Gordon's a tough vet that can give Dawson issues, but because I mean personally, just that Ricky Glenn fight for me is just such a big red flag. That cardio dump in that last round is just such a big red flag to me that this is just such a pass fight. And I would rather just watch, see the improvements from ATTs, and again, kind of like I iterated with the with Justin Connolly. I don't think lightweight is a great weight class for Grant Dawson personally. I liked him personally at 145. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I honestly I think it's just a point where he's a pretty big guy, and I just don't think he can
Right.
probably make it anymore. So
Yeah.
I guess we'll see how it goes for him at 155. But all right, next fight we got Mr. Andre Feely taking on Joe Anderson Brito. I believe you have a bet here, Lags. Let me know what you got.
Yeah, I got a small poke here on Joe Anderson Brito at 1 unit of plus 215. I just kind of think similar to the first fight tonight. I think Brito's just another solid soldier that has solid stylistic components that can give Feely issues. I think he's a powerful guy, hits hard, solid grappler, and Feely can just plays bottom. To be honest with you, and I think Brito obviously the cardio isn't a great from him, but to me he's just a huge finisher, solid grappler, and I think he's just going to be able to put it on Feely. But I guess my big concern is the cardio for him, obviously, and then him getting stuck on bottom because Feely's obviously a decent wrestler in his own right.
Yeah, I'm kind of right there with you as well. I did take a pop on Mr. Brito as well. It's one of those weird fights where I think it could, from some capacity, be, a levels fight, and Feely could just potentially big brother him. But if you go back and watch over the career of Andre Feely, despite fighting a higher caliber of competition, I will give him his due there. When his fights are standing, they're largely very, very competitive. When he's not front loading, early KOs in a handful of those spots, despite a guy with a 74-inch reach, dude doesn't really use it effectively at all. And the thing with Brito is, despite me thinking that Feely's a more technical striker, Brito's going to come forward, bite the mouthpiece. He's going to swing his hands. And I think he's going to have a decent amount of success on Feely. I'm just not convinced from what I've seen in watching Andre Feely over the last, 5 to 6 years that I've been capping fights, that he can just sit there and keep Brito like on the end of a jab over the course of 15 minutes. Like I'm just not convinced.
The dude's too hittable for that.
Yeah,
I
I'm
think
just
the
not.
guy defends strikes like 50%.
Yeah, so it's like I'm not saying that I necessarily think Brito outstrikes him. I just think it's close. Like I think it's competitive. I think it's in play, and I think optics also come into this because a guy in Feely is reliable to accept the back foot at points where Brito is going to be your little bull who's going to come forward. So as much as I love my, technical acumen and in all that stuff, sometimes optics and all this stuff comes into play. And once again, we're also talking about an over plus 200 price tag. The grappling is also where it gets interesting, though, and that's where I do have some concerns for Brito. Obviously, that latter portion against Bill Algeo isn't particularly encouraging. We do know Feely is a reasonably strong wrestler with a decent top game, but the problem with Feely is that his control ratio actually isn't very good per takedown if you look at it overall. Could he just sit there and grind out Brito if he's tired? Potentially, and that's kind of where my primary concern is. But to your point as well, I think Brito's live to potentially land takedowns in this fight. I saw him get swept by Sadiq in the first round. I saw him get controlled a bit by Sadiq in the second. We saw him get washed by Bryce Mitchell. So it's not as if we haven't seen Feely stuck there. And Feely is a guy who will play guard at points too. And we've seen Brito be strong from top position. We saw it there on the Contender Series against Diego Lopez, who's a pretty strong submission grappler to boot. And I think Brito is just in general, despite his shorter frame, he's a pretty strong guy, at the weight class to boot. So once again, my confidence interval here is not large by any means. I do favor Feely in the fight slightly, but I can't get to like Feely 75, 70% in this fight against a guy who's going to bite the mouthpiece, go forward on him, can wrestle and a guy in Feely who has fought close when it's went to the cards historically. So give me plus 230 on Mr. Brito, and we're going to see. Once again, could look horrible, could look stupid. I just think he has the tools to make this a close fight at the end of the day, which is all I'm asking for at a plus 200 price tag. So on to our booming co-main event. We got Mr. Jake Collier versus Andre Arlovski. I'll kick this one off. Man, I didn't think we'd be seeing a co-main event for these homeboys in a second, but nonetheless, it's here and we got to break it down. Honestly, I've been a bigger fan of both guys than probably anybody has in recent years. I've made a good chunk of money betting Arlovski fights. I've made a good chunk of money betting Collier fights as well. I think both are underrated in the capacities that they've been billed as. Obviously, they're getting booked against each other, so we got to talk about it here. Collier's definitely a high output dude who's going to chuck his hands, who I think actually moves pretty well, who I actually think has pretty decent cardio for the division. I know people will talk about his fight with Felipe, but I do think he slowed in that fight primarily due to body work, which is something that needs to be noted. Outside of that, I mean, he's still landing, over 100 significant strikes in his last two outings that have went extended. At the same time, though, homeboys hittable and eating over 100 significant strikes, I believe, in those outings at the same time. So people look at that. As much as I love my output, it would be easy to say Collier's going to throw more. That's why he's the side. But Arlovski is weird, man. Arlovski is a mythical creature in 2022, ladies and gentlemen. He can lull people into slower pace fights, but even then, he's shown he can fight in higher pace fights at the same time and keep a high work rate of his own. And my big thing with Arlovski is he's just better defensively than Jake Collier is. And I think that's probably going to be the difference in this fight is I think he can pull some prototypical Weasel Arlovski-ness in this fight. I know people talking about, Arlovski got submitted by Aspinall. Collier goes down and takes down Chase Sherman. He has automatic grappling advantages. I mean, Arlovski's only been taken down 4 times in the last 5 years. For context, right? Historically, Arlovski is incredibly difficult to take down. So I'm not going to be the person out here, even if I was to, be more so on the Collier side, to say that he's going to go out there and fucking wrestle, fucking submit Andre Arlovski. Get that shit out of my face. I don't think he takes Andre Arlovski down, personally. I think we see a prototypical slow-paced, or maybe not even slow-paced. I think it could be a higher output, striking based affair where Arlovski goes out there and weasels something, but it's one of those fights. I think it comes down to potential optics, who are our judges that are scoring this fight, which city we're in. Obviously we're in Vegas, but in general, it's just kind of one of those weird dynamics, a 15-minute heavyweight kickboxing match that goes to split decision. So I've seen some pretty big bets and strong takes on Jake Collier this week. My counter to that is like, what is your confidence interval in that, right? Like how much value are you extracting out of Collier at plus 110, plus 120? Like I get it. Like if he's plus 150 or something, or you want to back Collier by points. I know a couple of people that messaged me that say they got Collier by points at like plus 300 or something. I think that's a great bet, right? On a fight that's close and a high volume, close striking affair, Collier points plus 300, despite me picking Arlovski. I think that's a decent value based bet. But for me personally, I just laid it with the over at I think minus 190. It's just a heavyweight fight that should not finish at much of a clip. Or like I said, Arlovski's barely been finished. Collier, despite his hit ability, is proven historically to be pretty durable. Both guys don't wrestle, which limits grappling upside. I think this fight should hit the cards, probably over, 70, 80% of the time. What do you think, Lags?
Yeah, I was actually just going to mention there too. The Collier decision was actually like plus 300. Like, why would you not be betting that if you're on the Collier side? Because again, kind of similar to Jotko, he can't really bust a grape. I mean, is he the guy to put out Arlovski here? No. So coming into this one, actually, I was liking Collier, but coming out of it, it's like I kind of just think, kind of similar to you. It's just that close split decision that I think Arlovski actually does have the better footwork and is actually the quicker guy here, even though Collier's moving up from middleweight. I just kind of think that Collier at heavyweight's not exactly just anything special, to be honest. And I think this is just another one of those opponents that Arlovski can beat, the similar type of caliber as the past guys, to be honest with you. I think Arlovski weasels it. I think Arlovski by decision at plus 150 is probably the side here.
That's what I said in my Patreon, bro. If you're betting this fight, bet either by points. If you like either of them, bet them by
I mean,
points.
you can honestly bet both by points and you still profit. You got plus 150 and you got plus 300. And then that's actually, I guess I forgot to mention that in the GM3 fight. So I took GM3 no scorecards plus 120, but what I was opting for before that was, so they have GM3 sub as it plus 460 and then Jotko decisions plus 200. So I think both of those numbers are interesting too, because again, Jotko isn't finishing anybody and GM3 is only going to win the finish. But yeah.
I'm weird in that one because I do think that there's a chance that GM3 could weasel a decision there. I really do. Based on how he fights, I do think he could weasel a decision. But nonetheless, we will move on to our main event. We got Robbie Fonch from Brazil. Not really from Brazil, but that's just what I'm going to call him, Robbie Fonch. And Mr. Marlon Vera. What do you got here, Legs?
I've never been a Cheeto Vera guy, to be honest. I mean, we know this on the podcast. I don't think any of us really are Cheeto Vera guys. I backed Jose Aldo against them. I backed Davey Grant against them. I almost backed Frank Yeager against them, but I didn't pull the trigger there. Obviously, he was on his way to almost winning that fight there. To me, Cheeto is just a guy that's average everywhere, not great in any aspect, and he's just more of a durability bully, in my opinion. Like he's just kind of had a solid set of opponents that he's been able to like match up with. To be honest with you, like I think Rob is solid, more crisper striker here. Obviously, the 5-round nature is kind of interesting because I see a lot of takes with Cheeto in that 3-4-5 nature. But if Rob's kicking his ass in the first 2 rounds, is Cheeto just going to be able to just take over in those latter rounds? I just think Rob's the much better striker here. So at minus 130, I love it here, to be honest with you. So I have a unit and a half on Rob.
Yeah, interesting fight for me. I haven't played it yet, but I'm more so on the Font side as well for a lot of the reasons you mentioned. I just think Font's the better boxer, and when you look at his Vera historically, it's been the better boxing-based archetypes that have given Vera the biggest issues in the past, and I think that's what Font is, and Font's proven to be elite in that capacity. You know, the problems with Font have been, you know, multiple, you know, a guy like John Lineker walking him down, which I guess you could say is somewhat concerning because Vera is a guy who's going to come forward and throw heat at the end of the day. You know, he got dinged by Pedro Munoz, club and subbed there. He struggled with the wrestling of a Sunsao and then even just kind of the attritional boxing and then late with the wrestling of Mr. Aldo. The 5-round thing is what's kind of funny to me though, because Vera obviously is known as a guy to build throughout fights, right? So he starts slow. So I do actually think from some perspective, despite me being more on the Font side, a 5-round fight, I want to say favors Cheeto, but it like theoretically, like throw the matchup out the window for 2 seconds. Like a 5-round fight could be good for Vera in that capacity because obviously if you're starting slow in 3 rounds, you only got 3 rounds to work with. Now you have more that obviously 2 more to work with after that in a 5-round fight. But once again, I think the boxing of Font's going to be big here. And Vera, despite him being a better grappler, he's not a great wrestler, despite Font's, you know, takedown defense struggles and not looking great against Aldo in the past. In general, he's still a brown belt in jiu-jitsu and actually shown a pretty decent get-up game and shown to be competent outside of getting club and sub by Munoz. But, I mean, that kind of is just whatever. I think that's the only time he's been submitted in his pro career. So I just think Vera's going to face a ton of that boxing-based resistance. And despite it being a 5-round fight, you know, I still don't like how he starts slow, right? If you're going to drop a round, maybe 2, like he was losing boxing.
He loses every first round.
Pretty much every first round. So you can pretty much bank the first round for Rob Font. So there's that 100%. 2, even going back and watching the Frankie fight and the Davey Grant fight, you know, he was losing boxing-based scenarios in both of those fights. Obviously, he took over later against Frankie, but Frankie was still competitive standing there. Grant gave him a ton of issues too. I would say Rob Font's easily a better boxer than both of those guys, who's also much longer than both those guys too. Well, at least longer than Frankie, maybe not Davey Grant, but nonetheless, he's just better overall than both those guys. So Vera could continue to be one of these bonfires of money for me because I've bet against Marlon Vera multiple times in the past and it hasn't worked out well. I just think Rob Font's the better fighter. I think he does have the tools to give Vera some bigger issues. I understand some of the earlier money coming in on Vera potentially. But it's gotten bet down to a point where we're kind of sitting around that 55 or so percent on Rob Font. Honestly, I just think Rob Font's an underrated fighter. I just think he's one of those guys that has not been given enough credit. I may say the same thing about Vera in a lot of capacities in my own right, which is what kind of makes me a little bit nervous. But stylistically, in researching and taping the fight, I think Rob's probably 60 to 65% in this fight, which I think makes him a potential viable play. So we will see. All right. That looks like it's going to do it for this card. Let's see if we have any comments. Legs, you got anything you want to bring up in the comments? I don't think we got a ton.
I don't think so. We could start doing the insurance parlays, giving those out at the end of the podcast. You want to start doing those?
All right. You got something for this week, Legs?
I could pull up something. I could pull up something real quick. I could try to do it. Let's see what we got here.
I thought you said they killed them at FanDuel.
I think they did, but then somebody told me they brought it back last week. So I was looking at it because I played it last week, but the week before that they didn't have it for some reason. Because I think when MLB came back, they did like an MLB insurance parlay thing. So they killed the FanDuel one, I think, for a couple weeks, but then they brought it back. So I think it should be back. Fingers crossed.
Maybe we'll save it for next week, and we'll add that as a new segment. We'll throw the FanDuel insurance parlays out there for all you boys in the States that have FanDuel as an available book. But as always, guys, thanks for hanging out. We're approaching our 100th episode. Once again, hit that like, hit that subscribe if you enjoy the content on a weekly basis. I think we're probably one of the better podcasts out there in terms of putting out consistent content, putting out consistent winners. A lot of research goes into this every single week, guys. So we would appreciate your support. We appreciate your viewership. As always, me, SWR Betting, Luke, and my boy Danny Lags will have John hopefully back next week as well. Take care, guys. Peace. Let's make some money.